like to thank Justice for All for hosting this panel. I feel very honored to be with two very distinguished panelists and two human rights giants in Canada. It's nice to see both Alex and Monique again. And Alex, yes, I think the last time we shared a platform together, it may have been actually in September of 2017 when we spoke on Parliament Hill about the breaking Rohingya crisis, which came to the world's attention. I'd also like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to everyone from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people in the National Capital Region of Canada. And this discussion couldn't come at a more opportune time. We're a week away from voting when people are thinking about making their voting decision. And with respect to the specific question of the opening remarks, should foreign policy matter in Canadian elections? Yes, it should. And Alex, you were very correct. I think all three of us, when we think of foreign policy, we think of it from a human rights perspective. But when foreign policy generally is discussed in elections, it doesn't tend to be discussed from a human rights perspective. Unfortunately, promises about upholding international human rights during elections don't move the needle for a majority of voters and won't shift many votes, sadly, which is why it generally isn't among the top 5 priorities for political leaders to discuss on the campaign trail. Only when foreign policy directly impacts voters or a major constituency in the country in any manner does it become a deciding factor in voting intention. In my experience, over 40 years of voting, there have been only 2 examples where I think that foreign policy has likely been a deciding factor in an election. The first one, I think, was 1988, which was the election about free trade with the U.S. And would have required significant changes to foreign policy with respect to trade with the U.S. And I think the second was in 2015, when the Syrian refugee crisis was top of mind of Canadian voters and likely shifted votes to the Liberals under Justin Trudeau, given the frankly very sad and very disappointing approach that the Harper government took to the Syrian refugee crisis. But generally, it seems job creation and employment consistently rate high for many voters when it comes to foreign policy, and more so for those whose jobs depend on Canadian exports to the US or anywhere else in the world. Even during the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the US had nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert, foreign policy didn't generally tend to be a top 5 issue for voters, other than for the examples I've mentioned, which don't have anything to do, obviously, with superpower conflict. The only voting constituency where it seems that foreign policy is consistently a high priority is among Jewish Canadians and Zionists, where support for Israel by political parties is the support of their votes. And as we have seen over the years, that community has been very, very effective in its lobbying of the parties to make sure that their foreign policy interests are represented in campaign party platforms. Generally, however, it seems that voters are moved more by issues like healthcare and bread and butter issues than foreign policy when they're thinking about who to vote for. The other part of the question which was sent to us was, do candidate thoughts on foreign policy really matter? And specifically referring to the bilateral relations with key countries like China and India. It's interesting that you did mention China and India because, of course, the relationships that, with respect to foreign policy that we have with those 2 countries are once again very rooted in jobs and trade and not necessarily human rights. And when human rights is mentioned with respect to those 2 countries, it's mentioned as an aside. Now, in this election, China has been mentioned because, of course, issues around the 2 Michaels being detained by China have become an election issue, with the Liberals talking about the efforts they've made to try and bring these 2 Canadians home, and the Conservatives and NDP hammering the Liberals on basically their ineffectiveness in really pushing the needle on that issue. Unfortunately, that issue with respect to foreign policy and human rights is very much tied up with what the US is going to do because, of course, The detainment of these two Canadians was instigated by Canada serving or acting on a request from the United States about detaining the Huawei executive who was in China, or who was in Canada at the time, and is right now fighting extradition proceedings in the Canadian courts. But let's look at what the Liberal, Conservative, and NDP platforms actually say about this. And I'm quoting now from the platforms themselves. The Liberals' position on foreign policy is basically encompassed by this statement. Rising authoritarianism and the reemergence of great power competition is undermining international peace and security, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. Now more than ever, Canadians understand that building a safer and more stable world requires investments in our strength at home and active engagement with our partners abroad. With foreign threats and interference on the rise and the impact of authoritarian trends more widespread more than ever, it is time to place the promotion of democracy, human rights, and rule of law at the center of foreign policy. And that statement is in page 43 of the Liberal platform. The Conservatives have the following in their policy document. Canada's foreign policy is more important now than it has ever been in a generation. How our national leaders advance and defend the interests and values of Canada is no longer something we can ignore or take for granted. Canada's Conservatives will adopt a foreign policy that seeks new and strengthened alliances with democratic allies and economic partners who share our values. We will face down the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, standing with the Chinese people and promoting greater freedom for them. We'll be aggressive champions for human rights, dignity, and transparency. And that appears on page 16 of their policy document. And for the NDP, they say the following. Canadians are proud of our role in the world, and they want a government that will make the right choices to help people, but under Conservative and Liberal governments, decades of cynical politicking and cuts have meant that Canada is often on the wrong side of important global issues. New Democrats believe that Canadian interests are best served by a strong and principled foreign policy based on human rights, multilateralism, and the best interests of global peace and security. A New Democrat government will stand up to China with a strong and coherent strategy to defend Canadian interests at home and abroad. We will work with our allies to lead a robust and coordinated international response to China's disregard of the rule of law. Now that appears on page 35. It's interesting to note that both the NDP and the Conservatives specifically mention China. India, of course, in scanning the three documents, is not mentioned specifically. I'm sorry, I should say that the Liberals mentioned China at one point in their document and India not at all. The Conservatives mentioned China 31 times and India 9 times. The NDP mentions China 4 times and India not at all. And it's interesting to note, of course, that a lot of the references to these two nations and foreign policy is centered around trade. I think that we'll get into it obviously in the Q&A, but that essentially is my take on the issue of foreign policy. I think it's an important issue to discuss during elections, but unfortunately, I don't think that foreign policy is a huge factor in voting intentions among Canadians. So I think while the three party leaders will continue to mention certain foreign policy issues, I don't know that that's going to have an impact beyond a small minority of communities within the Canadian voting public. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.